What is asset protection? So asset protection is the culmination of legal strategies designed to prevent your assets from either being attached and sold in execution or in any way devalued. Why is asset protection so important in wealth preservation and wealth management? You see, it's the assets that actually generate the income. In most passive investments, one requires the asset and the income will follow. So take property, for example. If you own a property, the rental derived from the property is the income that you get to enjoy or pass down to your kids or to reinvest. If the asset is no longer there, there is no income. So how does one go about asset protection? In the South African legal framework and landscape, what does asset protection actually entail, and what are the best ways of going about doing this? Now, in order to understand this, we have to look at three different components to try and gain a feeling for which one of these actually matters to us the most. Because remember, the best strategy could exist, but if it does not apply to you perfectly, it could be a complete waste of your time, and it could actually compromise another strategy that could be more beneficial. Now, the three different components of asset protection are protecting the business from yourself, protecting yourself from the business, and protecting your businesses from each other. So these are quite simple. So protecting yourself from protecting your business from yourself was the first one. Now, if I as an individual take risks, maybe I'm a medical professional and I carry personal liability for decisions that I make. Maybe I have signed surety many times, and unfortunately I carry an inherent risk of something going wrong and my assets being taken away from me, right? So how do I protect my business from something happening to me? And this is where we look at the idea of removing everything from our name and placing it into a separate entity that can manage and hold those assets, such as shares or properties, and they can hold these away from me, right? Now, unfortunately, keep in mind that me simply having a company does not achieve this purpose, because in a company, I am still the shareholder. And if I am the shareholder, unfortunately, that does not protect the business, because my shares can be attached and taken away from me. So to truly have separation between myself and my business, I would almost need to give those assets, be it the properties or the shares in a company, over to somebody else. And that person would have to be very well protected. Now, obviously, everyone's thinking, why would I do that? That wouldn't make any sense. Giving things to, what if those people put themselves at risk? Yes, that's the thing. So with trusts, as an example, the trust is still operated by you. You are still there administering the trust, but you're doing it for the benefit of the beneficiaries. But the good decisions that you're willing to make to protect those assets are right there for you to take. You're just simply taking the assets out of your name and placing it into the trust to prevent any risk towards those assets. Now remember, it is important to note that if you did decide to take a trust, you do have to manage the trust for the benefit of the beneficiaries. It is no longer your property. It is separated from you. But that being said, if you're willing to make the right decisions with respect to the future of those properties and how to manage them, there's no reason why you can't do it through a trust. So the second facet is then to protect myself from the business. Now that's also a very important one, because businesses take risks. And let's be fair, the higher the risk you take, the higher the reward. So businesses like taking risk. And provided that it's not reckless, that's exactly what you want to do with your business. But if you're doing it in your personal name, any risk that you take will fall squarely on your shoulders. So what we want to avoid is a situation where it is you taking the risk and carrying the liability. Now, for this, companies are very, very useful because companies can make decisions, right, through their directors, and provided it's not reckless, it does not impute liability on the shareholders of those companies. So properly, to run a business, one would want to actually have a company and would want to hold the shares in the company, but allow the companies to make business decisions, right? And that covers facet number 2. Now, how do we combine facet number 1 and facet number 2? Well, we spoke about a trust potentially owning shares in a company that takes risks. We don't want the trust to take risks. We'd like the company to take risks. So one solution to this is let the trust hold the shares in the company and allow the company to hold the assets and to take risks and do the developments and run the businesses. Now, if it's not property investment and you're running another form of business and you don't feel that you're at risk in any way, I would still suggest using a company to run the business. So even if you don't need a trust because you're not worried about that first base of asset protection, at least the second one matters. And so I would strongly suggest if you're running a business, do it through a company from an asset protection perspective. There are other benefits too, but we'll discuss that in later chapters. Now, the third one is to protect your business from your other businesses. Now, this is very strategic. So people like to be neat and they like to file and organize things in particular ways. And some people, unfortunately, throw everything into one pot and hope for the best. Now, neither of these are right, but neither of these are wrong. It really depends on the individual. But do not carry a risky trade in a business, even if it's in a company. Don't carry a risky trade in a business through a company that also happens to have a very conservative trade that doesn't carry a lot of risk, because then unfortunately you're placing that at risk, right? So take, for example, again in the property space, if you have a nice buy-to-let and it's making money and there's very little risk and there's great value, and now you want to do this high-risk development in an area you've never worked on before, and you're going to be appointing contractors and taking on all this liability, why would you do that where you're holding the safe assets? So what you want to do there is you actually want to have it in a different business. So have two companies, as an example, running these two separate businesses, and allow one to take the risks that it has to take and keep the other one safe from having to take any risks. So keep this in mind. And when you start combining these three facets together, this is where the conversation around how trust work, how company work become very, very relevant. So even with trusts as an example, we have this concept of family trust where people put all their safe assets in the family trust. We don't want that trust to have any debt, any liability, any potential risk whatsoever, right? But then we have trust that we consider to be more commercial trust, business trust, property trust. And these trusts, they might hold shares in companies or they might hold properties directly. But those trusts sometimes expose themselves to risks that you should not expose your family trust to. Because, for example, there might be a deal where they ask the trust to sign as a surety, or something does go wrong where there's some form of shareholder exposure. So even at the level of the trust, you want to have the separation between your safe assets and your business assets. Within the trust structure itself, you want to have maybe those trusts that have the properties directly, and we'll explain later why sometimes that's a good thing. And we want to have those trusts that own the shares. Why? Because if you separate them, at least you mitigate the risk. So keep in mind, everyone has their own structure that suits them the best. But these are just a few examples of structures for pure asset protection that will work in your favor. And now to wrap up, the last thing that I want to mention is remember that it's very difficult to have asset protection, tax efficiency, and financing optimization all at their optimal levels. Unfortunately, if a person makes a decision where they favor asset protection, as an example, above all else, they might find themselves paying a little bit more tax than what they'd like, or they might find themselves in a position where they're not as attractive for the banks or any sort of financing, simply because maybe their assets are too far spread and they're spread across multiple companies, and unfortunately the banks don't see a balance sheet that actually appeals to them. So bear in mind that there is a balance that you need to find for yourself, and it's not always difficult to change it later. But remember that unfortunately, especially when it comes to larger assets like properties, it's very difficult to move properties and shares around at a later stage. So making the decision before you embark on an investment journey is an imperative.